Hello, this is Brett Lonsdale from Lightning Tools, and we're going to be doing a session on business connectivity services in SharePoint. And that doesn't really matter if you're using SharePoint Online or SharePoint on premises, also whether it's SharePoint 2010, 2013, or 2016. Everything that you're going to learn about business connectivity services here and our tools related to business connectivity services will be relevant to all of those versions of SharePoint. So, I'd like to welcome you to the session. Those of you who are not familiar of Lightning Tools, we are a company that is based in the UK. We also have a US subsidiary. We've been going for just over 10 years now, and we're also a RENCORE certified development company for our development best practices. So that means our code and our products meet all of the best coding standards for Microsoft SharePoint, and that's also measured against an ISO standard for our internal processes such as development, but also things like bug reporting and so on as well. Our products range from the business connectivity services tools that you're going to see today. So that's including a product called BCS Meta Man, some data visualization tools such as our data viewer, and also our charting tool, which is called SharePoint Chart. And then we've also got a number of other products as well that fill gaps in Microsoft SharePoint, including discussion forums. So we have an enterprise discussion forum tool, allowing users to be able to collaborate away from their email and have the benefit of things like moderation and so on as well. We also have a permissions management tool. This enables the business user, not just IT, but business user to report and manage permissions from within inside their sites and site collections. And we've also got a content aggregation tool called the Lightning Conductor as well, whereby you can roll up content from SharePoint lists and libraries across sites, across site collections, and also web applications in on-premises. And you can build your views based on that content without having to have any coding skills. You don't need to build display templates or XSL files and so on. It's just a case of building the view by selecting the checkboxes and also applying things like conditional formatting and so on to that view. So that way you can highlight important data such as overdue tasks and things like that. So all of these products, there's webinars in this series. This is actually the last webinar of this series. So all of the products have actually been covered in our webcasts, and if you navigate to lightningtools.com and click onto the webcasts link from the menu, you'll be able to see these recorded webcasts, so you can have a look at those other products if they're of interest. Okay, so a little bit about myself. I've been in the SharePoint space for quite some time, around about 14 years. I've been doing SharePoint stuff for coming up for 15 years. That's as a trainer, developer, and also, this is my area of specialization. So dating back to the launch of SharePoint 2007, Microsoft announced the Business Data Catalog, which has actually become Business Connectivity Services. And that's when we first created BDC Meta Man, as it was then known, but also wrote a book, which was the Developer's Guide to the Business Data Catalog, which allowed you to understand how to create different model files or application definition files, as they were then known, for the Business Data Catalog, but also how to work with the SharePoint API as far as accessing business data from within inside your SharePoint environments, but also through Office and so on. There's lots of old technologies in that book, using things like VSTO, the Visual Studio Tools for Office, and so on. We then developed the SharePoint 2010 Business Connectivity Services book, which was very different. We had back in 2010 the introduction of things like the external list. There was web part improvements, there was improvements to search and so on. And that is when we also saw the introduction of the SharePoint Designer capabilities for building external content types. So not a great deal has changed since 2010. There has been a number of improvements in 2013 with relation to the hybrid capabilities, and also in SharePoint Online as well. And 2016, we saw the capabilities for connecting to data sources such as OData as well. So there's been some improvements, but overall, the technology is pretty much the same in 2010, 2013, and 2016. So You won't find a later book than the 2010 one. Pretty much, otherwise we may as well copy and paste it and do some renaming. But also, writing books is a little bit like getting drunk. Once you've done it once, you might do it a second time because you didn't learn your lesson, and then the third time you start to question yourself. So that's a little bit about me. With regards to the agenda, what we're going to have a look at is an introduction to business connectivity services first of all, so that everybody is on the same page as to what BCS is, and that's going to make it a lot easier to understand what our tools do as well. So you'll be able to relate BCS Meta Man especially and the options in BCS Meta Man to what it's actually doing for you inside the SharePoint interface. So we'll have a high-level overview of business connectivity services, some of the different problems that BCS resolves for you. So if you're connecting to different external data sources, you've got silos of data inside your organization, yeah, how using BCS will help overcome some of those silos and those frustrations. And we'll also have a look at who's involved in working with business connectivity services, because if you're in a large organization, somewhere where you don't wear many hats, you might have to get involved with or the database administrator may need to be involved, giving you permissions to different external data sources. You may also have to have your SharePoint farm administrator or tenant admin involved to provision the services for BCS. So you'll need to go into the application services, make sure all of those are configured correctly, as well as providing permissions to the managed metadata store, which we'll talk about shortly, and setting up permissions on each external content type or model that you're going to be using inside of SharePoint. There's also some involvement for configuring search as well, which we'll come to and have a look at. So the farm admin, tenant admins involved, and then we've maybe got developers involved in building the external content types, and of course power users who will be involved in actually going through and configuring the different SharePoint components, such as the external lists, web parts, external data columns, integrating the Office client, and again maybe configuring search as well, such as content sources and pages. So we're going to have a look kind of in reverse. We've got some external content types already built. This will help you see what the benefits of using business connectivity services are, and then we're going to have a look at how to configure it. I do it that way just so you understand what we're configuring, rather than just starting looking at some files and it meaning nothing to you. So at the end, we'll have a look at the business connectivity services service application. I'm impressed that I can say that after several coffees today. We'll also have a look at building the external content types. I'm not going to spend too much time in SharePoint Designer, but I will just talk about that, maybe just even relate to a screenshot and just talk about the process inside of SharePoint Designer. We'll spend most of the time in BCS Meta Man and how we can use that tool to connect not just to SQL but also to many other data sources as well. And then we'll cover some of the usual gotchas, such as authentication. You probably heard the term that it works on my machine, coming from a developer, and with business connectivity services that's quite a common scenario. You tend to find that a developer is working with a small farm, meaning everything's installed on the same box. He's running SQL and all the content databases, etc., are on the same machine as the IIS services, is basically the SharePoint web front end. And if that's the case and you've got a simple test database that might be stored on that local server, then you won't find authentication to be a problem. You'll be able to use NTLM Windows authentication with no issue at all. But then you push that external content type out into production, where the SQL server is on another physical box, and then we start running into things like double hop issues and so on. So we'll have a look at authentication and have a look at some good guidelines around how you should set up the authentication for business connectivity services. Finally, we'll have a look at permissions, so how to set up permissions on your external content types, and also user profiles as well, and how BCS can be involved in that. So business problems that are resolved using business connectivity services, it doesn't really matter what size of organization you're running. Even if you're a very small company, you can spend a lot of time going and having a look at all of these different silos of data to bring a bigger picture altogether. And we're a small company. We suffer this same issue where we use Dynamic CRM for our sales team. We're using a separate system for our support and ticketing system, and we've also got separate accounting software and so on. And there's also, I'm sure, as in most organizations, there's lots of Excel files as well dotted around. But what we do have in common is everybody uses SharePoint. We've made the investment into SharePoint, so everybody uses that to collaborate. And since we've made that investment into SharePoint, we can use SharePoint as that central hub of information coming from all of these other silos of data inside our business. So we can connect to the dynamic CRM system, we can connect to the Excel files, and we can also connect to things like Sage, Line 50, or SQL or Oracle databases and things like that, and bring that data together inside of SharePoint. That really cuts down on training requirements. We might have a fairly complex system such as SAP. If you're using SAP, not every day, maybe you're using it infrequently, but have the occasional requirement to maybe see some SAP reports, and you're trying to navigate the SAP system to get that would require some training. So if that information was available to everybody in a report format, you'll be able to see that information perhaps with things like conditional formatting and charting, which is something else that we offer and we'll be having a look at through our data viewer web part and the charting tool. So SharePoint becomes that one place that everybody can go to view this information. You might be thinking, well, Power BI can do that. I've got other dashboard types. SharePoint Business Connectivity Services is very different. So yeah, Power BI is very good for reporting information, spotting trends within inside the business. What we're able to do with Business Connectivity Services goes way beyond that. We have the ability to work with data that resides in a list as though it is a SharePoint list. So we can create items, we can update items, delete items. We can use it also to tag our existing documents. So if we're creating a proposal and storing that proposal for a customer inside a document library, one of the things we might want to record is, well, who is this customer who's this proposal for? So we can find that document more easily in the future. And we could do that, sure enough, by creating a single column that is a single line of text. But then we're going to get inconsistent data stored inside that document library metadata. So we'll have people typing in titles of companies that maybe have abbreviations or typos and so on, and that way using search and using filters inside those lists and libraries is going to be inconsistent. So if we have a CRM system that we can connect to, whenever we upload a document to a document library, we can actually look up the customer from that CRM system directly there inside the document library. So it makes all of this information come together inside of SharePoint, and I'll hopefully show you lots of ways that can happen. So the high-level view of the architecture. On the SharePoint server, we have a number of different services. We have web parts. The web parts provide you with a read-only way of viewing that data, and the web parts are designed, if you like, around a relational database. So you have a business data list web part. You also have a business data related list web part. So inside your underlying database in the relational database management system, if you've got one-to-many joins, or even many-to-many, so we've got a junction table, we can reflect that same structure inside our SharePoint team sites. So in a simple example, if you think of the Northwind database, where we've got things like the customers table related to the orders table, related to the order details table, we can show that same exact scenario inside a SharePoint team site using these web parts. So we can click onto a customer that's of interest. We can then see the orders related to that customer, and by clicking onto one of the orders, we can see all the order details for that order. And so on, and we could carry on with that. We could also see like the employee who placed the order, the salesperson. That can be shown in a column format as opposed to a row format using another web part. So that's the business data item web part. And there's a number of other web parts as well that we can use and add onto our pages. We've also got search, and I'm speaking there for SharePoint on premises only. If you're using SharePoint online, then you don't. But using the search, what we can do is index that underlying data source as well. So now we've got a single place to go to if we want to find information. Again, think about SAP and the complex environment that has. If you occasionally want to look up some customer details or employee details, you can do a search using your SharePoint search site and return that information on the search page. So we'll take a look at that as well, and that's really powerful because you're bringing back content from within SharePoint as well as content from your external data sources in a single search page. There's the external data column that I mentioned. There's also an API. So there's a client-side and a server-side API that allows you to work and build your own solutions. There's a user profile as well. So if you think of an employment system that you might have as an external data source, we could bring some of the employee profile information from that to complement the SharePoint user profile, and that allows us to get better audience targeting and better user searches, people searches inside of SharePoint as well, because we've got information that may come from people's resumes and so on when they've stored those inside a document. We can take that information, such as what skills people have and so on, and bring that into business connectivity services and the user profile. And then finally, I've mentioned there the external list. So the external list is looks and behaves like any ordinary SharePoint list. One difference is the data doesn't actually physically reside inside of SharePoint. It remains in the external data source. All we're doing is displaying it inside an external list. The benefit of that is obvious. We're not going to run into synchronization issues. If we're connecting to a large data source, we're not importing all of those records and overinflating our content database with that content. So the data resides where it is. We get to view it, but we can still create new items, we can edit items, and we can delete items. And they are features that you don't have to have. If you want to keep it read-only, that's fine. If you want to be able to just create items as a sort of depositor type of scenario, then you can do that as well. Or if you want to provide the full CRUD capabilities, then by all means do it. It's down to you as to which of those methods you create when you're building the external content type. So all of these things are sort of server-side services. We've also got in the Office client as well a number of tools that integrate. Some there that are deprecated tools or on their way out, like InfoPath. SharePoint Workspace is coming back to haunt us here, but so that was deprecated a long time ago. But we've also got things like Outlook, Excel, Access, Word, Visio. These all integrate with business connectivity services. So we can take things like an external list full of contacts and pull that into Outlook. We can build gauges and so on in Visio that is based on external data through BCS. We can also obviously pull that data into Excel. We can create Word documents that have lookups to the external data source, and almost like a mail merge, we can fill out different parts of a document based on looking at content from an external data source. So these are all the services that we get. The way that happens is there's a server-side BDC runtime and also a client-side BDC runtime that you can install. That allows us to also authenticate against the data source and connect to these different external data sources using different connectors. So there's an OData connector, SQL connector, WCF and .NET Assembly connector. You can create custom connectors. So that's one of the things BCS Meta Man does. There's a custom connector for things like Salesforce.com and Dynamics CRM. But you can also connect directly to things like Oracle and DB2 or Sage Line 50 and so on and so forth using Oracle specific TNS services, or we can also use ODBC and things like that to connect to these external data sources. So you'll learn how we can do that using BCS Meta Man as we go through. So the people that are involved, as I mentioned, we've got SharePoint admins. So the role of the SharePoint admin when it comes down to business connectivity services is to instantiate the BCS application and proxy. We've also got the configuration of security. So we need to make sure that all the users that are going to be using BCS have permissions not just to the underlying data source, but also for the external content type. And of course, they then need permissions to the site where the content is being displayed or used as well. So there's several layers of security to make sure that your users are going to be able to connect to that data and use it. There's configuring search as well. So that's done by the SharePoint admin. DBAs, they need to provide logins, they need to provide permissions to the external data sources, and perhaps even auditing as well. And that should be a consideration when you're building your external content type, is who are these, or how do we want to recognize the people that are accessing this data? Do we want to use pass-through authentication so we know who's accessing the underlying data source, or are we quite happy to use a single username and password and basically have basic authentication with that data source? So there's some considerations to make, and you can use pass-through authentication, you can use single sign-on through the secure store, and you can also use basic authentication as well. So SharePoint developers, they have the job of creating external content types and therefore making the data available in the first place. Obviously, they need to have an understanding of the database structure, what tables, views, store procedures are required inside the solution, and to make those available. And also having a good understanding of the architecture of a database. So what primary keys and what foreign keys do we have is all useful information to have when you're building an external content type. Finally, we've also got the SharePoint information worker. So they are the people that will be configuring the web parts and building the external lists and so on. So we'll have a quick look at what BCS offers. Slides are here just as really a backup. So we're going to just jump into SharePoint and have a look at some of this stuff. So I've got a BCS site, and I'm going to click onto to products. Okay, and inside my external list, inside the products external list, you can see that I'm viewing data. I've got this all of the columns. I've got all of my rows. We can filter this if we want to. You'll also notice that each row, when I click onto the ellipsis here, I've got the edit item, delete item, and view item capabilities as well. So all of these map to methods inside the external content type, which you'll begin to see. When I go inside the external list, what this is actually doing is calling a single method. If you've used SharePoint Designer to build an external content type before, you'll see that it's called the read list method. In the underlying API, or in BCS Meta Man, you'll know it as the finder method. And the finder method basically contains a select statement that is doing the equivalent of a select star from entity. So select star from table name or select star from view. And it can have where clauses on it, which are basically filters. Those filters can be wildcard filters. So if we wanted to leave this fairly open for the user, we can have a filter where the user could search on the company name using a wildcard. So they could just type in the first few characters of the company name and bring back the row of data that they're looking for. You can have multiple finder methods as well. By building multiple finder methods, that's actually going to build you multiple views automatically inside an external list. So if we wanted to segregate our data by country or something like that, or product type, then we could do that and have those as pre-built views. So even when the user just goes to create a new external list, those views will already be there and created. So if we go up to the list ribbon here, you'll see that the external list is just like a standard SharePoint list. We can create new views, we can modify the current view, we can export to Excel, we can click onto items and obviously do things like create new items, delete items, etc. All through the ribbon interface there. There are some things that you won't see. You can't set up permissions on an item. You can set up permissions on the external list. So the external list permissions are just like any ordinary SharePoint list permissions, but there is no such thing as an item permission inside the external list. So if they can access the customers table, they can see all the customers, in other words. So that's an external list. You'll be able to create those easily just simply by going to the Add an App from the Site Actions menu, and you'll see the external list. So in here we have the external list tile, and we can choose or give it a name, obviously, and we can choose the external content type. So on the external content type picker, you'll see all of the external content types that we've deployed to the SharePoint environment. So there's several here that I've got. So we can basically go through and connect to one of these. I'm not too clever with the naming of mine. Bear that in mind. When you go through and create an external content type, this is what the end user is going to see. They're going to see the typically the entity name, and they're going to see a namespace. So when you come to name this information, it's a really good idea to obviously provide a namespace that is meaningful to the end user. So if it's Dynamic CRM, we may want to provide that with the entity name of customers. So we can choose one of these, click OK, and that is basically going to create us our external list. So very quick and easy to go ahead and build that. We also get the web parts, as I mentioned. So these are read-only. You have web part connections. We'll just go through and add a quick page. So let's add a page to this team site here. Since I've already got some web parts on the page that I want to show you, I'm just going to call this web parts webinar. Click create. Okay, and what I like to do is just split my page up to two columns. And what we're going to do well, first of all, we're going to click onto the save icon. That's always a good idea. If anybody's very familiar with working with web parts, you can go through and configure the BCS web parts, and then you'll land back on the page after saving and closing it, and your web parts won't be there; they'll be hidden. And then you have to use the $contents equals 1 on the URL to go through and delete them. So it didn't save properly. So what we can do is go to the business data section, and in here you'll see all the business data web parts. All the BCS ones begin with the words business data. So in here we'll see the business data list, and we've also got the business data related list. So if I add the business data list web part onto the page here, and I'm going to click onto open the tool pane, and we basically go through and set the type, which is the external content type. So in here, let's connect to this one. So this is our customers, and we'll hit apply. Okay, and then we can see we've got some customers in here. And over on the right hand side, what I can do is go through and insert another web part, and this is going to be the related list web part. So once again, these are read-only web parts, but the benefit that you get is the ability to go through and relate these two together. So as I open up the tool pane for the related list web part, we're going to map that to an orders entity. So in here I've got orders. Okay, and it will pick up an association. So an association is something that we can build easily in Meta Man by dragging and dropping from one entity to the other. So that entity is basically mapping the primary key of the customers list to the foreign key of the orders list. So once those two have been mapped, the last thing, which is often overlooked, is to provide a web part connection. So we connect those two web parts together, and then we can save and close the page. And once we've saved and closed that page, notice that we can select a customer here, and we can see the related orders for that customer. Okay, so and we could carry on with that. We could then have the order details for the order and so on and so forth. Some of the limitations with the web parts, they're difficult to customize. So you do have an XSL editor, but really you are starting off with a blank canvas and not much help. So if we just go into the web part properties, for either of these two web parts, the function will be the same. So we go into the edit web part properties, and you get this XSL editor off to the right here. So as we click onto the XSL editor, just give that a moment to pop up if it wants to. Maybe it needs a bit more encouragement. Nope, it's not going to open. Anyway, so that is basically going to pop up the equivalent of like Notepad. It's going to be an empty box and expect us to go through and add the XSL to apply styling to the data, and that's what the data viewer is all about, that we'll have a look at. You can easily go through and apply styling, conditional formatting, and so on. And just to give you an example, if we go into the products external list that we saw earlier on, when you bring the data in from an external data source, there's sometimes just some small things that you want to fix, like the unit price here is showing to 4 decimal places. It doesn't have the currency symbol, and it's marked as a currency data type in the underlying data source. When we go into the home page of this particular team site, I've got the data viewer that is displaying that same external content type, but I've been able to apply conditional formatting as well as doing some little fixes like the data formatting. So under the unit price, notice that's being formatted to a currency at 2 decimal places, and to do that you tick a checkbox. You don't have to write any XSL or anything to achieve it. So they're the web parts. Useful to build a dashboard. You can create actions as well. They can be used inside of the web parts and also in the external list as well. The way that you would configure an action is to go into central administration, or again, you can use Meta Man to do it. So in central administration, you're basically going to build a URL. The URL could be something like google.com, and when you do a Google, if you try that, just go to Google whatever you want, Lego or something. You will notice if you have a look at the URL that it has a query string which contains your search parameter. So what we can do is actually build a URL like google.com and add a parameter, which might be something like the company name column, and that gets mapped to your URL, and you'll have a little action button for each row. So if you have a user that can see a list of customers and they want to Google one of those customers or look that customer up on LinkedIn, Sales Nav or something like that, then they can just click an icon and it will launch it. And as you can see, you can control whether that goes into a new tab or the current one, and so on. We've got the external data column as well. So this is actually my favorite part of business connectivity services. So as well as being able to view and work with our external data as though it is inside of SharePoint, we can also create external data columns. So inside this document library here, I'm going to go to the library ribbon and create a new column. So if you're familiar with this, we can create lots of different types of columns, single line of text, multiple lines of text, and so on. But there is this one called external data. So maybe I'm going to store customer proposals in here. So I'm going to put the name of the customer and store that. And rather than have a single line of text where people will enter in the customer name, I'm going to choose the external data option and map that to an external content type. So I'll choose customers. And just like any standard SharePoint lookup column, we get to choose which value we want to store and what values we want to display inside our document library. So we could go through and grab some of those and click OK. And notice how we've now got those columns displayed inside our list. So, so in here, I'm just going to simply upload a document. So we'll browse out to a file. Doesn't really matter which one. Okay, so let's just pretend that this isn't a business connectivity services training PowerPoint slide deck. It's a proposal. So what we can do is go in and edit the properties. And now we have this customer field, which is a lookup to that customer's entity. Now, herein lies a problem. I see a whole bunch of customer IDs. I don't know which is actually which customer. This could be simply a sequence of numbers. So when you build your external content type as well, I'll show you that there's a show in picker property, and this is the picker. So if I want the company name to show up, then I need to set the picker to show in picker property to true on the company name column, and then I'll see a list of customer IDs along with the company name. That way I can just simply select one of these and choose OK, and it will map that data to this field. Notice also that there's a find. Now that won't work here because I've not actually built a filter on my finder method. So what I can do is build a filter on the finder method. I could then select the filter, provide a value, and filter these results. That's not just from a useful standpoint. That's also to overcome a SharePoint failing, if you like. So this picker can actually only display 250 items inside the picker. So if you've got 500 customers, that's not going to work for you. So what you can do is filter down those 500 items. And one way to do that is build a wildcard filter, so we can you just type in the first few characters of the company name that we're looking for, and therefore you're guaranteed to bring that down to less than the 500, or sorry, less than the 250 limit. So I'll choose OK. So that's stored the name of that customer that I can't pronounce. We'll hit save. And in here you can now see that we've got the customer name, the address, city, and country all stored inside that document library. That's going to show up in search. I can also filter this list based on that. I could build views on that information. I could also build web part connections that connect to things like the BCS BDC list web part. So we could then select a customer and see all the documents related to that customer, and so on. So some really powerful features that Business Connectivity Services offers in SharePoint, but also inside the Office client. You can see here some of the sort of Office integration. And for the benefit of the time, I'll just refer to the slide here. So this is just a snippet from a document library. We get that same lookup that you just saw inside the document library inside a Word document. So these are quick parts. You can go into Word and choose Insert Quick Part. Select one of your fields from the document library, such as the product name or the customer name, and you can also display those other fields that we just mapped from the lookup column and place them wherever you want inside your document. So that way, when you create a new document, you can just simply choose the customer and it will fill out all the address for you, or you can choose the product and it will fill out the other fields. So really useful integration features like that. Search is also a feature, so you can index the content. We'll have a look in search to see how to do that. So once you search on one of those items, you get a link, and notice the page that this is going to. So you get to build what's known as a profile page, which is the landing page for the search result. Clicking on the search result won't take you to your external system. It will take you to a profile page. So you need to build that profile page. It's relatively easy to do, and you then have a landing page for the search result. Okay, so there's some configuration in here for the external content types and the service applications. This is a snippet of Central Admin. So we can go into Central Admin, click onto the Business Connectivity Services service application. This is where you get to typically upload your external content types to. BCS Meta Man will deploy here directly, but in there you can see all the different things like the creation of the profile page, setting of permissions for the external content type, adding a custom action, and things like that can all be configured through there. SharePoint Designer can be used to create the external content type. So launching SharePoint Designer, you'll see on the navigation pane that you've got the external content type section. From there, you can go through and add a connection, build an external content type, map all your tables, build the associations, and so on. You can see over here on the right, you've got the create, read item, update, delete, read list methods. So we get to do the same thing in Meta Man. The difference is with SharePoint Designer, really you can only connect to SQL databases, it gives you the choice of three things: SQL, WCF, or .NET assemblies. The latter two you obviously have to write the code for to make those services available, or the .NET assembly. So typically it's just SQL that SharePoint Designer can connect to. So MetaMan can connect to hundreds of data sources, really, whether it's through OData services or ODBC or direct connections, which we'll have a look at in a moment. So these are the things we're going to build inside or using MetaMan. So we have each of our methods that I mentioned. We've got the finder, specific finder, creator, updater, and deleter. So that finder method allows us to bring back the data. The specific finder is the read item. So as I go into, say, a external list, and I click onto an item to open it up, or I choose view item, that is then calling my specific finder method. It's passing through the identifier for this row. So the identifier is the product ID in this case, and returning that single row. So SharePoint's got to offer that ability. You've got to have the finder and the specific finder methods. You can't have an external list without those two. The creator, updater, and deleter are optional. So that gives you the ability to obviously create items, update items, and delete them. And then you've also got the ID enumerator. Now, SharePoint Designer won't create an ID enumerator for you. BCS Meta Man gives you that option, and that's used for search indexing. The benefit of this is it's always a good idea to set a limit filter on your finder method, and that limit filter is basically going to bring back a subset of data, so you're not over or going over the thresholds of an external list. So you don't want your search to be limited by a limit filter, and therefore we have an ID enumerator which will index all of the rows for you, and search knows to use that method. And then there's other properties, identifiers, filters, actions, and so on that we can set as we go through MetaMan. So all that said, yeah, we can get it to OData as well. Just to point that out. You can also build apps in Visual Studio to make external data available in an external list directly. And then we've also got authentication to refer to. And I'll refer to this as we go through and configure the external content type in BCS Meta Man. But basically, you've got 4 different options when it comes down to providing authentication. Okay, so I'm just going to jump forwards to BCS Meta Man. So BCS Meta Man will start up and open up that tool. Should actually, sorry, already be open. There we go. So I can open up BCS Meta Man. Let's just make that full screen. So BCS Meta Man allows you to connect to all of these different data sources. So you'll see that there's things like Dynamics Online, there's Salesforce.com, there's Oracle, there's ODBC, and under ODBC we've got a list of different data sources that we can connect to, but that's not a limitation, that list. You can choose the other data source section, and as long as you've got a connection string and an ODBC driver installed, you'll be able to work with that data source. So a good place to go to is connectionstrings.com. From there you'll be able to obtain different drivers and connection strings to connect to the data source if you're choosing. There's SQL Server, there's SQL Azure, there's WCF services, and so on. All of these things that you can connect to using this tool. So I'm going to connect to SQL just for ease. And what we've got here is the obviously these fields are going to change depending on what data source you're connecting to. So if we go up to OData, it's asking for an OData service. If we go to SQL Server, it's asking me for the server name, type of authentication that I want, and the database that I want to connect to. So in the drop down here, we can actually choose which database, which is a kind of an advantage over SharePoint Designer already, because SharePoint Designer you need to type in the name of the database that you want to connect to. It's not a lookup column, which will be fun and games for some of these that have GUIDs. So we can provide a database name, hit the go button, and that will connect to the database and give me a view of all the different tables, views, and stored procedures stored inside that database. So we want to work with some of these different entities. So what I'm going to do here is drag across customers, Okay, so these are the methods that we can connect to. So I'm going to tick them all. So I have the create, update, delete, the ID enumerator, as well as the two required ones, finder and specific finder. And I've also got the identifier set, which is my customer ID. So one important thing on that, when you're working with business connectivity services, this is not specific to BCS Meta Man, this is business connectivity services. You have to have a single column that is unique or contains unique values. It doesn't have to be the primary key, but it does have to contain unique values, otherwise your specific finder won't work. So here we hit create. We can preview the data. You can't do this in SharePoint Designer. Here we can preview the data, and yes, again, this is really well named database. Try connecting to something like SAP, and all the names of the tables are really obscure. They're four-digit names in uppercase letters. They don't really mean much. They're German abbreviations as well. So unless you speak German, it's even harder to try and determine which table is which. So here we can see what data is being brought back, and really all we'd have to do is hit generate at this point, but I'm going to go through and set some of the properties. I also want to connect to orders, so I'll go through and create the same methods for that, and then we can drag and drop an association. So this allows me to set the join, so dragging the customers to the orders, and then setting the primary key and the foreign key, click and create, builds that join. And that's what allowed me to build that scenario on the page where I had the customers web part, and when we click on a customer, it shows me the orders related to that customer. We'd had to have built this association first for that to work. So other things I can do, I can right click each entity, go down to configure entity, and in there I can do things like set the title column. That makes the user's life a little bit easier. It's one less property that they have to set by going into the web part properties or going into the list settings for an external list. So that just makes the company name, in this case, the title column, meaning it's the hyperlink to open up the item. I can also go through and build different methods. So in here, I'm going to build another method. We'll call this the country method, and I'm going to make it's a finder, so that does the select star from table name, and I'll save that. So up here I get my country method, and in there I can go through and add a filter. So I'm going to have a country filter, which will be mapped to the country field. Obviously, we can set the operator, so I'm going to say equals, and my default value is going to be a wildcard. But obviously I could replace that with an actual country, whether it's Germany, France, United Kingdom, United States, etc. So we'll hit save. So we've got our new country filter on the country method, and yeah, I can basically save that. That's been built for me. We've also got, as well as the methods, the actions. So like I say, you can build these in Central Admin, but I can also do it here in SharePoint as well. So, sorry, in BCS Meta Man as well. So I can choose something like a Google search, click add. So there's my Google search. I've got my URL here with the parameter all set up for me. All I need to do is add the relevant column that I want to be able to search on, which is going to be company name. I don't really want to search on the customer ID. That wouldn't make any sense. So that's it. I can just hit save, and I've got a custom action created. So really simple stuff to achieve. The show in picker that I mentioned. Sorry, wrong page. So if I go to the methods, click on the finder method again, I can go to the company name and choose show in picker. So so that allows me to see the company name inside that picker control. So let's just hit update on that. I think somehow I just missed my country. Let's just go through and add that again. Yeah, not sure how I managed to get rid of my country finder method. So let's just go through and do that one more time. So we had to make a mistake somewhere along the lines, just so you realize that this isn't a recording. There we go. So we'll have country equals wildcard, save. save and update. Okay, so once we've done that, we'll see our methods in here. So there's the country method as well as all the other methods created. Up in the top right hand corner, we get to configure our settings. So which version of SharePoint are we deploying to? What are we going to call the model file name? What are we going to name the namespaces, etc. So this is just set to BCS webinar. So I'll hit save, and I'm going to hit deploy. So that will go ahead and deploy this to SharePoint. Now I might actually get a warning here thinking about it, because I've already got an external content type that has customers and orders in it. So it might complain. I might have to go through and delete that. Since this is the same two tables but with a different name, we'll see how it goes. Okay, no, that's fine. It's gone. The only thing it has flagged up is a warning that my country field doesn't have a limit filter. That is just a warning. So I could easily go through and set that also in the properties for that country method. It's nothing to worry about unless you're going to be bringing back more than 5,000 items in that method alone. So that's deployed, and we can go through and look at SharePoint now. So we'll let's add an external list. So we'll choose the external list tile and look up from our list of external content types. Sometimes you just see a white box. There we go. So in here, right at the very top is we now have BCS Webinar Customers, BCS Webinar Orders. So we'll select the customers, click OK, and let's call it BCS Webinar Customers. Hit create. Sometimes that create button needs a bit of extra encouragement. There we go. It's a bit like your TV remote when the batteries start to go, you have to press it harder. So here is the BCS Webinar Customers showing as a newly created external list. So we can go in there and we get an issue. Okay, so obviously this was planned. The issue, why is that? That's occurred because actually I'm running SharePoint on a different box to the SQL Server. So it's trying to authenticate as the anonymous user logon. So let's go back and see where we went wrong. So I chose Windows authentication. So Windows authentication isn't going to work here because I'm using classic authentication. So it was fine for Meta Man. Meta Man could see the data and everything, but actually I want to use the secure store to handle all the authentication, or username and password. So here I'm going to go through and just set username and password. Hopefully that's the right password. It's not. It's one of two passwords because I'm not sure if I had an American or an English keyboard layout. There we go. So same sort of thing. We should now, let's just go through and configure that. Build our join. Hit create, and I'll just go through and configure that method one more time. So under methods, let's add country. With the filter on it. Mapped to the country field, operator is equal, default values, wildcard. Let's update that. Okay, so sorry, one more time, it's disappearing on me again. Oh, there it is. Yeah. Okay, so so we have our data. All I need to do now is deploy again. So let's just give that a slightly different name. Let's just call this BCS Webinar 2. Save and deploy it. Okay, so this is the other issue that I mentioned we might run into. So this is because we've already got a model that's very, very similar. So we need to just hop here into Central Admin. Okay, just whilst that's loading, what I also want to show you here is another feature of Meta Man is we can actually test models as well. So you can authenticate against your SharePoint environment here. And one of the things, once you've built a BCS model and deployed it, you often go to test it, you go and configure the search, build an external list, add some web parts, and just make sure that everything is working correctly as it should. So you're going to be able to make sure that you're writing back to the underlying data and so on. This allows you to test all of your methods without having to go through and actually create the items inside the user interface. So once it's authenticated, should be there any second. There we go. These are all my models that are deployed to SharePoint. So we can go to one that should work. It's this one. So we've got a get all method, get all orders method. So I can right click that and run it. You can see here that this accepts a filter for the limit filter. So we can test our limit filter and execute that and see the data coming back. So every single method you can go through and test without having to actually go into SharePoint and configure all of those different entities. So we've got Central Admin loaded up. Let's just go into the Managed Service Applications. And under Business Data Connectivity Service, if we change this to BDC models, we can see the BCS webinar. There it is. So I'll just delete that. Oh, this is all fun. I'm just going to upload. Let's import the model because that would have saved to my desktop. So there's a BCS webinar 2.bdcm file. So we'll open that and import it. So we can do it that way as well. Actually, that's a good point because quite often you're going to be deploying directly to a non-production environment, and then you want to move it to production. So you can just simply give your administrator the model file to go and upload. Okay, so that should just take a few seconds, and then we can go through and add the external list and see that in action. Sometimes it's fun to race it, so let's do that. Let's go here. In fact, we'll jump back into Chrome. So we'll add that. So we've got the login failed at that point. Just to talk about that for a section whilst we add this, So the double hop issue was the reason why that didn't work, because we're using Windows authentication. So I'm passing a token from my client machine to the SharePoint server, but it can't do that second hop to pass your user token to a SQL server from the IIS server effectively. So if you use Kerberos and you've got all your trusts in place, that won't occur, but Secure Store overcomes that as well. And we've got some good blog posts on our website about the Secure Store. So using BCS Webinar 2, we can select that, give this a name, so I'll call it again BCS Webinar 2 customers, hit create. Okay, and I can feel you all in anticipation whether this is going to work. So let's go to BCS Webinar 2 customers, and there we go. We've got our data. And notice we've also got the country field, country view automatically created. So we can now go onto that, and it doesn't show us any items because we've got that filter. That's useful because we set that as a wildcard filter. That's more useful inside the web parts because you'll actually find that you've got a filter dialog at the top here, whereas now I have to go into the properties of the view to set the default filter and so on that country field. Okay, so that's BCS Meta Man, and we've had a look obviously at BCS. I know we're going over the hour, but what I do want to do is just show you briefly the data viewer and the benefits of that, as well as the chart as well. And I'll also just briefly mention that if ever you want to customize the external list, the forms that you use to build items. So for example, if we go into the new item of our newly created customers, you can see this is a very, very, very basic form that's used to create items. Using our new tool, the Lightning Forms, you can actually go through and customize the layout and the logic of any SharePoint list, but also Business Connectivity Services external lists as well. So you could go through and change the layout with tabs and add more validation. You can create calculations in here and so on and so forth using that product. There is a separate webinar on that, so if you again go to lightningtools.com, click onto webcasts, you'll be able to see forms in action inside the SharePoint lists and external lists. So on the BCS page, we'll have a quick look at the business connectivity services data displayed inside my Lightning data viewer here. So this can be configured to connect not just to BCS data, but it can also connect to data sources directly. Obviously, if you do that, you just get the web part with that data. If you use BCS, you get all the other benefits that we've seen, such as the search, the external data column lookup, and so on. So here we're connecting to BCS. We go to the data source tab, and let's just refresh that. You can see that it's got a drop-down list of all those external content types. It's mapping the read, create, update, delete methods. And if we go across to columns, we simply get to see or select which columns we want to display. You can set filters, you can add calculated columns to this as well, so additional columns, and also on the display tab is where we get to do things like conditional formatting and data formatting. So that case where we had the unit price set to 4 decimal places, all we had to do there is hit the drop down and choose currency. That was it. That fixed the problem. No having to write any complex XSL. You'll also see under the conditional formatting that it's applied. It's against the units in stock field. So if we select that, you can see how easy this is. I can just apply conditional formatting to the cell or to the whole row, set my condition, so units in stock is less than 25, and pick a color. So let's just change the color, and we'll save that. You can have ands and ors in there as well if you want to. We can allow for the CRUD operations, so the insert, update, delete, all the pagination, and basically all the different properties that make up the web part. Hit save, and we're able to view that data the way we want to see it, and not have to write any XSL or anything. And the chart, this is also working with that same data source. So this is working with the orders table. You can see here in the chart that we've got an exceptionally good quarter, which was 1998. And if I select that, we can drill down into that chart to see the number of orders that we have across each month in that quarter. And you've got the breadcrumb trail that takes you back again, and so on. So you've got multiple levels of drill down. So this chart can also be connected to data sources directly, such as Excel, SharePoint lists. We can also connect it to some of our other web parts, like the Lightning Conductor web part, so you can aggregate results from multiple SharePoint lists and then build a chart on them. But here we're using business data connectivity, connecting to examples. Let's actually we should see the new one that we just created. So BCS Webinar 2 right at the bottom there. And we'll select an entity. So we've got our customers and our orders. So I'm going to change this chart. We'll connect to customers instead. So I can view the data. Again, so it allows me to see what data I'm going to be bringing back. And as we choose next, I'll select the customer ID and the country, and we'll choose next again. And so you can again see the summary data coming back there. And I'm just going to group that data. So I'll enable grouping. We're going to group by country. And I'm going to count the customer IDs. So once we apply that, we'll get to see how many customers we have in each country. Okay, so there's the count. That perhaps be displayed better as a pie chart. So we've got a 2D pie chart or a 3D pie chart. This is our actual data. So we can go through and we can preview what it's going to look like. You can see this is quite busy with all the different labels on there and everything. So let's in fact make it 2D. 2D looks a bit better, and we'll come down here to the labels, values and tooltips section. And what I'm going to do is just turn those off. So that makes our physical pie chart a little bit bigger without those, and instead we'll have a legend that is going to allow me to see what each of these different colors relate to. Okay, so there's numerous settings in here. You can change things like every color, every background, every border can all be modified. We've got the different cosmetics on there as well that you can modify. I'm just going to hit finish on that. So we've changed our chart, and you can see we've got that now displaying on the page. And we can go through and highlight different sections of that pie chart. And if ever you're bored on a long webinar that's gone over, you can spin that pie chart around and things like that and entertain yourself. Okay, so at that point, I'm going to open up for questions. So the way that we're going to do this, if you have a question, one thing you can do is raise your hand. So you should see the raise your hand icon inside the BCS webinar software. I'll then be able to unmute you and you can ask your question. So we have a question from Hussein. So Hussein, I'm going to unmute you now. Oh, you might have to unmute yourself in this case because for some reason it's saying you need to enter a PIN. I'm not sure why that is. What you can do, if you can't ask a question, email in your question. So if you can email it to brett@lightningtools.com. So that's Brett, BRETT @lightningtools.com, and I'll be able to answer any questions there. Okay, I don't think there's anybody else. So I'll take those questions offline. So feel free to email Brett at lightningtools.com if you do have any questions on anything that I've shown you here, whether it's BCS or the BCS product related, and I'll be sure to answer those. And once again, the webinar was recorded, so that will be posted up on our site. You'll find that under lightningtools.com/webcasts. So that will be up there this evening, and you'll be able to watch this back or share it with any colleagues. Okay, so thank you very much for joining. I hope you've enjoyed the webinar and look forward to speaking to you soon. Many thanks.